32 most useless Pokemon ever! From this very weak Pokemon that runs away when it's spotted, to this useless creature. These are 32 Pokemon that are good, but for nothing. Starting with Dunsparce, that looks kinda scary. Its first and second evolution are not that different from the original. So not only is it useless, all its evolutions are useless too. It just grows some inches and can barely fly with its teeny tiny wings. Don't worry, it isn't the world's weakest Pokemon, but Magikarp is. Take a look at this! This Pokemon is famous for being unreliable and for no reason. It jumps and splashes about, making it easy for predators like Pidgeotto to catch it mid-jump. It is virtually worthless in terms of power and speed. How pathetic! What's even more pathetic is this Pokemon that disguises itself as a tree so it won't face its enemies. Sudowoodo is one of those Pokemon that appears smart, but I'm afraid to say that this creature is a coward. It runs away from water with every little chance it gets. This is one of those Pokemon that has desperately needed an evolution for generations now, but has never gotten one. Well, that's better than evolving and still being useless. Chansey is the Pokemon I'm referring to. I know you would want to argue with me because this Pokemon uses its egg to save injured people and delivers happiness, but aside from that, what can it really do? This creature can't even stand a chance in battle. They just sit there healing and bobbing their heads on your opponent's side of the field. I would advise you never to choose a Chansey in battle. Neither should you choose this Pokemon that can't even move in battle. I could see the disappointment in Ash's eyes after he picked Metapod for battle against Pinsir in the Indigo League. Metapod didn't even need to move before getting crushed by Pinsir. It is a very weak Pokemon that is just surviving in its shell while waiting for its evolution. No one deserves that, not even Watchog. You see, Watchog is a Pokemon people often forget about, filling the role of the most basic of all basic Pokemons. I won't even go to its stats because they're just awful. There really aren't any builds for this Pokemon that people use in competitive settings because most people don't even remember this little creature exists. What breaks my heart is milking a Pokemon so it can survive. Miltank needs to be milked every day or else it will fall ill. Even its Pokédex entry confirms that Miltank is very even-tempered and prefers not to battle. Of what use is a Pokemon if it doesn't want to battle? You know what they say. The cuter they are, the more hopeless they're generally going to be. Just like Bidoof. I must admit, back in the day, I was kind of fond of Bidoof. It was kind of adorable. Its evolved form was big, gormless looking, and sort of endearing. I had no issues here. Not until I found out that it constantly gnaws on logs and rocks to whittle down its front teeth. This is the only thing it does! Worst of all, it nests alongside water. When thinking of useless Pokemons, few come to mind as quickly as Luvdisc does. Luvdisc has a unique situation where it has a memorable design, but is unmemorable just about everywhere else. However, most trainers, upon receiving this Pokemon, will likely just toss it in their box after grabbing the heart scale from it, with no offensive stats and wait for thin defense. This heart gets broken by everything and everyone. The only thing it's useful for is fighting it to steal its heart scales. At least it's useful for something, unlike this Pokemon whose body is composed of refuse. To start, Wormadam has anticipation, an ability to simply let the Pokemon know it's about to be run over by its opponent. Then, despite it having 3 different type combinations, they are all relatively weak combinations. Wormadam just doesn't have a great move pool outside of maybe Quiver Dance. So with all due respect, this Pokemon is just not worth using. I wouldn't also convince you either to use Unknown in battle. Even though it has 28 separate forms, it's still useless. This mysterious Pokemon can't do much on its own except 2 or more are gathered. Plus, it barely leaves its own dimension as it is rarely found venturing outside. Kinda like this slime Pokemon. Ditto is kinda like a copycat, or should I say a copy slime. It can copy any Pokemon, but it will have lesser power than the original. Nothing beats the original. Just the way Lunatone will never be the moon or Solrock the sun. Lunatone and Solrock as a duo, and a mere staring at their eyes can make you pee in your pants. Their stats aren't horrible, but but they're not good enough to be considered great because their move pool can only be described as odd, and they're not even tough as a pair in duo battles. In general, they're pretty forgettable. The crazy part is that they don't even evolve. The next not-so-useful creature on the list is Talonflame. I know you would be wondering what was going through my mind when I added this creature on the list. You may also think it's a hell of a stretch to call Talonflame useless. After all, this brave creature was the hero of Pokemon X and Y. But oh, how the mighty have fallen. Its Gale Wings move was made ineffective in the 7th gen, and now it only works when the user has full health. This simple move clipped Talonflame's wings in a big way, essentially removing it from existence for the most part. Since we are dealing with flying Pokemon that have been rendered useless, let's talk about Delibird. How do I battle with a Pokemon that has the chance of healing the enemy? The first time I learned about the present move, I actually paused watching some episodes for a while. It's an attack that has 1 over 10 chances of healing the enemy. That's wild! And here's the weakest of all the baby Pokemon, Azurill. It battles by flinging around its tail, which is bigger than its body, and that's all it can do. What if its tail were to be cut off or injured? What a waste! The only snag is Cast Form is the very definition of a wasted opportunity. While I really like the fact that they have a different form in each weather condition, the problem here is that you can't make use of any of them because their stats are nothing to write home about. HP 1, Attack 0, Defense 0, Speed Attack 0, Speed Defense 0, and Speed 0. Saying it alone hurts my feelings. But nothing hurts me more than this Pokemon. Jigglypuff, known in Japan as Purin, is a Pokemon species in Nintendo and Game Freak's Pokemon franchise. If you catch a low-level one, it only knows an attack that doesn't do damage. It's the dumbest Pokemon ever! Speaking of dumb Pokemons, Farfetch'd is one of them. It is usually found holding a leek or onion, and just like its name, it is Farfetch'd because of how rare it is. That's better than having all these spiderwebs like Spidops and still be useless. Spidops doesn't have the stats it deserves, and that's one of the primary examples fans point to when asking for better early game bug Pokemon. Not only that, but Spidops' ability Stakeout sounds great in certain situations at first, but because of its truly horrendous speed and general move pool, Spidops is a hard sell for anyone to use over something like Lokix. Imagine a useless Pokemon evolving into a more useless one. Burmy is that Pokemon that evolves to a weaker Wormadam that I talked about earlier, and it's just a clump of helpless leaves on a stick. Prove me wrong and change my mind. Kakuna, on the other hand, is useless until he turns into Beedrill. Kakuna uses the Harden move, and it does nothing of use. Attacks, Harden, and that's that. When a Pokemon is modeled after a cricket, but the only additions to it are giving it a mustache, chances are it's not going to be great in a fight. Kricketot has 384 total stat points, which is a decent amount more than some other Pokemon on this list. But that's about all it has going for it. It is weak to fire, rock, and flying, 3 of the more common types to see in Pokemon, and its move pool isn't great either. For a Pokemon introduced in the 4th generation, it really feels like Kricketune should have a more memorable design and a bit more impact in a fight. Toedscruel and its pre-evolution Toedscool, despite looking absurdly similar to Tentacool and Tentacruel, are apparently entirely different Pokemon. That does make sense, considering that Tentacruel has some usage in the competitive scene, while Toedscruel seems to be pretty weak overall. This Pokemon has one ability, Mycelium Might, which basically means that status-affecting moves will always go last, but the moves will ignore any abilities that would otherwise cause the status effect to miss or be ignored. Sadly, priority is everything in Pokemon, so this ability actually hinders a Spore or Toxic build for Toedscruel rather than improve it, and it should be clear why this new Pokemon is sadly lackluster. Another useless Pokemon is Midstrevus. Midstrevus lives in caves. As a nocturnal Pokemon, it spends its days sleeping in darkness and its nights startling people with mischievous tricks. I wish this Pokemon wasn't as useless as Wishiwashi. At the start of battle or at the end of each turn, if Wishiwashi's HP is higher than 25% of its max, it will transform into its school form. If it's lower than 25%, Wishiwashi goes back into its solo form. In its solo form, Wishiwashi is one of the weakest Pokemon of all time, with a stat total of 175. Seriously, it's even weaker than Magikarp. But in its school form, Wishiwashi has an absurd absurd 620 stat total, putting it on even footing with some pseudo-legendaries. So it's all about keeping this fish above 25% and switching out if it goes below. It becomes useless then. Stunfisk, a creature known for being one of those hilariously dumb-looking Pokemon that people always use in joke posts or to make fun of the extreme range and quality of Pokemon designs. There are only two problems I explain why no one seems to use this Pokemon. It has bad typing and a poor move pool. Swap its typing around or add more moves to its pool, and Stunfisk has a fighting chance. Not to mention, it's one of the ugliest Pokemon in existence. And out of all the Pokemon type combinations out there, Jumpluff has it the hardest. This type combination means that the Pokemon in question have 5 different types of weaknesses to worry about, with one of those weaknesses, Ice, being 4 times as powerful against them. Take that innate disadvantage, put it on top of a forgettable Pokemon design with decent base stats but a poor stat spread, and the result is a primarily useless Pokemon named Jumpluff. Jumpluff isn't all bad, as the Pokemon does have a pretty impressive speed stat as well as a special defense stat. Its move pool, ability pool, and both their attack and special attack stats are so lackluster. Granted, if the lightest fully evolved Pokemon out there was actually a powerhouse in disguise, it wouldn't make much sense anyway. Rattata, known in Japan as Ratta, is a Pokemon that lives wherever it can find food, which it searches for most of the day. Thanks to its sharp fangs, it is able to chew on nearly anything. Rattata has high speed, but the rest of its stats are very bad. All it does is only to tail whip. Its move, Fear, is useful, but ghost types melt it. As soon as the baby Pokemon mechanic was introduced, it was plain that Pikachu would get an infant form. It's Pikachu after all. Pichu, the baby Pikachu, is one of the fastest and most agile too, but that doesn't count for too much when you have all the strength of a one-legged kitten in a coma. In my eyes, Pichu's just a cutesy little slice of fan service, and the baby forms of Pokemon don't really add too much to start with. Up next is an inclusion that's a bit of a tragedy, purely because Vespiquen has such an incredible design. But unfortunately, this Pokemon is on here mostly because bug flying type Pokemon are almost at as much of a disadvantage as the infamous grass flying combination, but they're just a bit better against ice types. Still, Vespiquen's high defense and special defense stats, as well as its absurdly low speed, make it seem like it should work as a damage sponge. Ultimately, Vespiquen suffers from a lack of identity in terms of its utility. It has all these signature moves such as attack order, defend order, and sometimes heal order, but none of them are really worth using given its mediocre attack and HP stats. Well, that's better than being so easily replaceable. Sunflora, the sentient sunflower Pokemon. Sadly, every role Sunflora could possibly fill is exponentially better to use a different Pokemon in. Every other chlorophyll user is a better choice than Sunflora. Its pure grass typing is a rough sell, and even the unique ability it has, Solar Power, can be used by Charizard. I know people do like Sunflora, but in design and concept. So here's a question for you Pokemon fans. Which Pokemon do you dislike most and why? Before you answer that, check out this video where I've covered 50 secrets you didn't know about Pokemon.